Thank you, Osi. Before I get started, I just would like to really thank the organizers for inviting me and putting on such a great meeting. So if we could just give them a round of applause. It's been wonderful for me to be here, to be able to vet Rob. And one thing I did was the important part that Daryl's trucks have played in bee research in Manitoba over the last 40 years. And so if there was a transportation award, Daryl, I would nominate you. So I was asked to talk about protein nutrition in honeybees, and I think this is very good timing for that because you're probably all starting to get really tense as we all do this time of year and think about feeding your bees. And so I just want to point out that this bee is feeding on a protein patty. I don't remember what the ingredients were, what kind it was, but this is actually pollen. So she's just having a snack. She's not packing that onto her corbicula. The general understanding is that bees do not pack protein patty stuff onto their corbicula. They don't store it in the colony. They just use it as they need it. So I think most of you in this audience are very familiar with what bees need. Bees are animals, of course, and so they need the same things as other animals. They need water, they need a source of carbohydrates, and for them that comes from the nectar from flowers, but they also need proteins and fats and minerals and vitamins, and all of that comes from the pollen. Pollen is providing all of these other things that they don't get from honey. And in particular, these are needed to maintain adult bees, but more importantly, to rear the developing brood. And the quality and quantity of pollen affects the number of eggs that are laid, but I would argue much more importantly, it affects the number of those eggs and the larvae that are actually reared all the way through to adulthood. And so pollen supply is going to directly affect the number of workers that your colony can rear. The protein content of natural pollen can vary dramatically depending on the plant source, from a low end of less than 10% to above 35%. And generally, when it comes to bee nutrition, we consider anything over about 25% protein in pollen to be excellent. 20 to 25% it's good, it's solid pollen, but less than 20% is poor, and they would struggle to rear brood on pollen like that. We're very fortunate in the prairies that a lot of our pollen, at least in the midsummer, is coming from canola. Canola is a relatively good pollen for bees. It's about 20 to 27% protein. It varies depending on the growing conditions and the variety of canola. It's also about 7% fat, which is a good amount of fat. And more importantly, it's really obviously very abundant when canola is in bloom. So if we have to have sort of one major crop in terms of a pollen flow, canola is a good one for us to have. Generally speaking, bees don't collect pollen from grasses, of course. They don't collect it from, wheat or barley or oats or from conifers, although sometimes they do. I have done pollen trapping early in the spring when the conifers are blooming. We do see that in samples. We all know, because bees, as Corey said, right? I've seen them collect all kinds of things. I've seen them collect coal dust because it's the right particle size. I've read that they will also collect the mites that are associated with cheese production. So bees will collect things that aren't necessarily good for them. Now there are 10 essential amino acids that bees need, and they need them because they need to get it from their diet because they can't themselves synthesize these 10 amino acids, and then there's an additional 10 that either the bees or their gut bacteria can synthesize. And the reason amino acids are essential in the diet of a bee is because amino acids are the building blocks of proteins, right? You string amino acids together and you get a protein. And so when we're talking about amino acids, whichever nutrient is in the lowest supply relative to the needs of the bee, that's the one that's limiting. So if you want to make a protein that looks like this, these are the amino acids you're getting in your food. You can't make this protein because you only have one red dot, right? And you need two. So that one's limiting. It's limiting the number of the proteins you can get. No matter how many blue or green dots you have, you can't make this protein because you only have one red dot, right? And that's how amino acids work. Really simplified form of it. And so this is just something that's often used in crop nutrition. So maybe some of you who farm other crops have seen this. It's just a barrel, saying that whatever is the lowest stave on your barrel or nutritionally, that's the one that's limiting. And in natural pollen, it's often tryptophan or methionine. Those are the two amino acids that are most frequently limiting in natural pollens. Often in products that we buy to feed our bee protein, it's often lysine and arginine. So there's different limiting nutrients in natural pollen versus some of the products that we can purchase. So I want to sort of reframe our thinking about pollen nutrition in our colonies to sort of a pipeline, right? And nurse bees are that pipe. They're the conduit of protein nutrition for the colony. They're specialized to digest the proteins and deliver it to the other individuals in the colony, whether it's the brood or the other workers, through these protein-rich hypopharyngeal glands that they produce in their head. So this photo is the hypopharyngeal gland that's found in the head. It's like a string of grapes or pearls or something. And when fresh pollen is scarce and colony is in a pollen deficit situation, middle-aged bees, or in a real famine, really young bees, will transition to foraging. And when this happens, they also transition not only early to foraging, but also with a preference to look for pollen. So I think most of you are familiar with temporal polyethism, and that's just the age structure to the jobs that a bee has, which is very similar to what people do, right? So when bees are young, so this is the percent of the time spent in each activity. This is the age of the bee. So when bees are young, they're spending time cleaning their room, just like our kids do, right? First thing they do, they learn to put away their toys. As they get older, they might help their siblings, they might put away some other stuff, clean up the living room, whatever. And only when they're older do we send them outside the house to find employment, right? And so these are our older bees. These are the bees that are foraging. And this age shift in the jobs that worker bees has is accompanied by a shift in the physiology of workers. So nurse bees have high pollen consumption for at least the first week of their life. They have high vitellogenin. Vitellogenin is just an egg precursor protein. They convert that protein into royal jelly. The amino acids in their hemolymph, circulating in their hemolymph, are very high. And because bees, they have low titers of a hormone called juvenile hormone. So I know it's confusing. Young bees have low levels of juvenile hormone. As they transition, they're sort of intermediate middle-aged bees, and then when they're foragers, they have low pollen need in terms of what they're consuming themselves. Their vitellogenin, that yolk precursor protein, is low. They start soliciting jelly from younger workers. The amino acids in their hemolymph are low, and their juvenile hormone levels are higher. So this shift in what bees are doing is correlated with a translation in the physiology of those bees. What we see is that when bees are starved, or when bees are stressed for some reason, almost any reason, when bees are infected with some kind of parasite or pathogen, those can quickly lead to a shift in the status of the bees, and they shift into forager status. And so now you've restricted or limited that protein conduit into your colony because you have fewer nurse bees. So as beekeepers, I think many of you can sympathize with this picture. This is spring, where I am from, in southern Alberta. And as beekeepers, we supplement the diet of our colony really for three main reasons, right? The first is because there's a dearth. There's nothing for them to forage on, and they need us to feed them because there's nothing they can collect in the environment. The second is that there's forage out there, but the weather's inclement. So maybe it's too cold or it's raining and they can't get out and forage. And the third, and probably the most common, is to increase the productivity of the bees beyond what the environment can sustain, or not necessarily increase it, but shift the timing of that productivity. So these are doubles. These beekeepers here have shoveled off the snow, unwrapped them, and they're putting on pollen patties and apivar strips, back when apivar worked. So I think most of you are probably commercial beekeepers, but whether you're a commercial beekeeper, a sideliner, a hobbyist, what I want you to start thinking about are what are your goals as a beekeeper? So if you're like Kevin here, Kevin wants to produce a lot of honey. He also pollinates hybrid canola. And in southern Alberta, those two things coincide. If you're a blueberry pollinator, for example, you might want your peak populations much earlier than someone who's pollinating canola. Or maybe you're somebody who sells bees, whether it's nukes or queens or virgin queens or whatever, the timing of when you want your maximum population is going to be different, depending on the goals of your operation, what are you trying to produce, and so that affects the timing and the amount and the types of feed and inputs that you put into your operation. Some beekeepers, I would argue, don't even want large populations. If you keep your bees in a very urban area, these can be very problematic, right? You don't want your swarm flying away on a delta plane. I also want you to consider what landscape do your bees experience. And not only what landscape, but at what times of year what is the landscape offering? Sometimes we tend to think, oh, rural areas are really rich in resources for bees, but that's often not true. Sometimes they can be food deserts, at least at some times of the year. And some urban areas can actually be quite good for bees. Depends on stocking rates and the seasonality of things. So this is just a photograph of I do a lot of pollen trapping for various reasons. This is a photograph that shows each month for one of my yards what the pollen income was for a week. So in April, you can see we have a little bit of pollen. May, it really picks up. July, we have tons of pollen, but we already want our big populations in July. So it's almost like way too late. And then in September, it's down again. So not only does the environment play a big role in what the landscape is offering to your bees, but the timing of year can make dramatic differences, and even year to year. So you need to sort of keep tabs on what is blooming when, and not just in terms of honey production, but also in terms of the pollen flow and the nutritional resources that are being offered to your bees by the landscape. But what I really want to talk to you about is a series of experiments that we did on protein supplementation in honeybees in the prairies. Now, before I started, I did a survey of the literature, and there's actually a lot of studies that show absolutely no benefit to protein supplementation. So they put patties on bees and find no benefit. This is one such study. So this graph just shows the number of adult bees plus capped brood, so the colony population over 12.5 weeks. And they found that regardless of what they fed them, whether it was Bee Pro, Brood Builder, Mega Bee, Nothing, Ultra Bee, or wildflower pollen, there was no difference. The colonies all lost population, and they all lost population statistically equally, right? So there was no benefit to all the expense and the labor that the beekeepers had gone into feeding these bees. But this is during a late summer dearth in Florida, right? So a lot of the studies that have found no effect are not from, the prairie region of Canada. And when you survey across the whole literature, what we find are a couple of patterns that emerge. One is that spring feeding, as opposed to summer dearth feeding or fall feeding, spring feeding of protein supplements tends to be associated with some kind of positive health or population outcomes or productivity outcomes, and as well Canada as opposed to the US. And I don't think it's Canada versus the US. I think it has to do with latitude probably and the types of landscapes that we're working in. So in general, things that are studying pollen or protein supplementation in Canada and in the spring feeding context tend to see a benefit, whereas others maybe don't. And this is one example of a Canadian study. So again, this is population in terms of the cumulative numbers of workers reared by these colonies over the study period. This is a study out of Ontario on early spring feeding from mid-March to the end of April. And they had 3 different treatments. One was a control, so they just left them alone, and you can see they grew over that 6-week period. Some that they trapped all the pollen. They had a pollen trap on them, so they were collecting all the pollen. The colony was bringing back, pollen traps are leaky, so they're collecting most of the pollen. And you can see that the controls that they didn't trap pollen from grew more than the ones they did trap pollen from, but the ones that they supplemented grew substantially more. So this is an example where in the spring in Canada, supplementing with additional pollen did provide a benefit in terms of increased colony populations. Okay, How many of you feed your bees some kind of protein at some point during the year? Almost everybody. How many of you are sure you're doing the right thing in terms of, is it dry patty? Is it liquid? Is it a patty? Is it how much are you feeding? The timing of your feeding? How long are you feeding for? What diseases, what pesticides are you potentially putting into your colony? What's best for your bees in terms of their nutrition? And I will tell you right now, we don't know scientifically what's best for bees yet. We're working on it. And cost. Do you know that you're getting a good return on your investment for the labor and the cost of your supplements? I don't see any more hands up.
Confident in spring, but maybe not in fall.
Confident in spring, but not fall. And I will come back to that point because it's a good one. Yeah, I was not confident either. And so we set out with a commercial beekeeper in my area to start to kind of chip away at some of these questions. So the first thing I did was do a survey of the various diets that are out there in terms of protein supplementation for bees. Very common protein sources are pollen-based, yeast-based, algae-based, egg-based, dairy, or soy-based. But a whole number of things have been used. I think Rob mentioned pea flour yesterday, meat, fish meal, chickpeas, peanuts. Beekeepers are endlessly inventive, and whatever they grow in their local area that has protein, it's been tried. But I will point out that the commercial products that you as a beekeeper can buy don't have to list their ingredients or their nutritional information, and most of them are actually quite high in sugar. So you don't really know what you're feeding your bees. If you use a recipe and make your own, you at least know what you're putting in. There's lots of different recipes out there. Many of them are quite good, but it's a pain to make pollen patties. There are some patty producers who will make to your specifications, which is another option. So what we did was we evaluated commercially available bee products, things that you can buy, measuring consumption of the product and the growth of the colony, the adult and brood population, in a commercial operation that manages for canola pollination, so hybrid seed pollination in July in southern Alberta. So just a point about canola seed pollination compared to maybe something like blueberry or cranberry or the tree fruits. The thing about canola is that the major honey flow and the pollination coincide. So you have to get your maximum hive population at that time because there's no generating a source of income later, right? So if you don't make the grade for your pollination rental fee, you're losing money. If you don't have population at that time, you're losing honey, which is money, or we hope it is when the prices are high. So the experimental design, we worked with the beekeeper. He had some singles. He was overwintering in an indoor building. So he brought singles out directly from the wintering building to a common holding yard. All these colonies were in the same yard. They were barrel-fed syrup. We did it over 3 years. And in each of the years, we experimentally fed these various food supplements for 4 to 5 weeks ad libitum, which just means as much as they wanted to eat, we fed them, so they never ran out of the product. So the treatments that we chose to test for various reasons were Feed Bee, which it's unclear exactly what it is, but it's plant-based, not soy. Global Patties, 15% pollen patty, which is pollen, soy, and yeast. Product from a company called Alltech, which makes a product called Bee Pollinate, which, just to be clear, does not contain pollen. And this was prepared by Global using their ingredients. It's a yeast-based product. We had a trio treatment in one of the years, which was the Feed Bee, the Global 15%, and the Alltech product in the same colony. We also tried in one year the Global 0% pollen, so there's no pollen, which is soya and yeast-based. We tried an algae-based product by Healthy Bees, and we tried the Mega Bee product. And in each year, we followed the same basic experimental design. These were pelletized, so 4 colonies on a pellet. Each colony received one of the different feed types in each year, depending which ones we were testing, so that all the treatments were replicated on each pellet in various orientations that we switched up. So like Robin was saying, they weren't always on one corner. Our bees always drift to the downwind side, so we're very cognizant of that. In 2019, we had a control treatment with no patty, just to see, do we even need to feed them? Are we getting any benefit? We measured the population before the treatment at 2, 4, and 6 weeks after we started feeding, and then we did a cluster score at about 6 weeks, which would be near to the time of grading for pollination rental fees. So I apologize, it's late in the conference for so many graphs, but I will try to lead you through them and just give you the highlights. So Robin already mentioned what these letters mean. My letters mean the same thing. So if the letters are the same, they are statistically the same. So this graph is total patty consumption over the whole 4 to 5 week treatment period in 2018. And we had 3 treatments that were consumed the same amount. The pollinate product, which contains no pollen, Global 15, which contains pollen, and Mega Bee. The bees consumed those products at exactly the same rates. Feed Bee was a patty that we made with the dry Feed Bee. We mixed it with flaxseed oil, made our own patties. They consumed it much less. And then Trio, that treatment is really interesting to me, and I'd like to keep thinking about that because the Trio, remember, that's the one where they received pollinate, Global 15, and Mega Bee all in one colony. So they could choose what they ate. And they actually ate the most in that treatment where they had variety. This graph just shows you the consumption pattern within that Trio treatment. And I thought, oh, well, if they aren't consuming much of the Feed Bee patty I made, maybe if they have a choice, they just won't eat any, but that wasn't the case. The consumption within those colonies that had a choice really very closely mirrored what we saw when they had no choice. So they ate less of the Feed Bee, but they were still eating it. They ate these two, the pollinate and the Global 15 at the same rates. So, of course, when we took them out of the wintering building, we measured the amount of capped brood across all our colonies, and it was actually almost zero, virtually zero in most of the colonies, and it was even, so the starting amount of brood was equal among all the treatments, and it was equal when we finished. So all the colonies grew in terms of the amount of brood in the colony, but they grew equally. So even though we saw differences in consumption, they ate more of the Trio treatment and less of the Feed Bee treatment, there was no difference in how much brood they produced. There was also no difference in the cluster score or the adult population. So the dark bars here are the initial cluster score. They were the same size colonies across treatment groups when we started. They were the same size colonies across treatment groups when we finished. So all the colonies grew, regardless of what we fed them, and regardless of whether or not they consumed less of it or more of it, all the colonies grew. So this really got me thinking, and I was like, okay, so why are we feeding them? So in 2019, remember, we included that treatment control where we didn't feed any protein supplements. So that's why this graph only has 3 treatments, because the 4th ones weren't fed. So this is the subsequent year. This is, again, cumulative consumption over week 1, week 2, week 3, so that's why it keeps going up. We have 3 different treatments. The blue line is that pollinate product from Alltech that contains no pollen. The orange line is the global 15% pollen. And surprisingly, this brown line is the global 0% pollen. So they actually consumed more of the product that didn't contain pollen, which surprised me, until I got the results back on the nutritional analyses of the patties. And so what we've come to conclude is that non-protein ingredients, of course this makes sense, but the non-protein ingredients also affect consumption. And so it turns out the global 0% is higher in sucrose, and the global 15% and the pollinate product are higher in glucose and fructose. And the ratios of the sugars affect the bees' preference for the sugars. So depending what sugars they make your protein patty from, that can affect the consumption. So this is the same year, and this time we have that control treatment in here because this is the amount of capped brood at only 2 weeks after we started feeding them. So you can see there's a little bit of brood in the controls, but a lot more, almost over 4 times more in the ones that we fed. So feeding them did make a difference in terms of how much brood they were able to produce, but it didn't matter what we fed them. Whether we fed them the global 0% product, the global 15% product, or the pollinate product, and regardless of how much of the product they were eating, they grew the same amount in terms of brood production. That lack of brood in those control treatments kept going all the way through the experiment. We actually had to start feeding them before because the beekeeper wasn't too happy with what they were looking like. So it actually went all the way through to the pre-pollination cluster score. So this graph is the cluster score, how many frames were covered with bees 6 weeks after we started treating them. You can see that the controls are indeed smaller. They were only about 7 frames of bees. The ones that we fed more were about 13 on average frames of bees, and again, no difference among the groups that we fed, regardless of what we fed them or how much they ate of it. This is results from the 3rd year of that study, and so the first 2 years we actually kept our holding yard in, it was a beautiful site. The beekeeper was very generous. He gave us this beautiful riparian area as our holding yard, and we were like, you're being too nice, we want a crappy yard. Give us your worst yard with no spring pollen, because we're not seeing that this is making any difference what we're feeding them as long as we feed them. So he did, and these 2 graphs show on the top the brood area at 2 weeks, and the bottom is the brood area at 4 weeks after we started eating. And so I know the text is kind of small for you at the back, but we have global 15%. That had the largest brood area at both 2 weeks and 4 weeks after we started treating them. The global 0% pollen product was sort of intermediate at week 2 and significantly lower than the 15% pollen at week 4. At week 2, the bee pollinate product with no pollen was significantly lower than the global 15% pollen product, and the same at week 4. And the healthy bees, which is an algae-based product, was significantly lower at week 2. It had less than half the production of brood of the global 15% pollen product. But by week 4, it was not significantly different than the global 0 bee pollinate and the healthy bees product in terms of the amount of brood area the bees were rearing. This graph shows the cluster scores for the same feed treatments. So global 15%, which is the one that produced the most brood, it makes sense. They had the most number of bees by the end of the experiment, but it wasn't significantly different from the global 0 or the bee pollinate. So even though we saw these transitory differences in the amount of brood being produced, by the time they went to pollination, those differences had sort of vanished in terms of the adult cluster scores, but they did persist through in the healthy bees treatment. So they were the ones that were fed healthy bee patty, which is the algae-based patty. At 2 weeks, they had much lower brood scores, and that did translate through all the way to cluster growth. So why does feed type, what product you're feeding them, make a difference in some experiments and not others? And remember, I told you about the 2 different yards we used. I think partially we can answer that through this graph. This is the feed efficiency of the global 15% pollen product. It was the only product we used in all 3 years, and this is the feed efficiency in terms of the amount of brood the colonies produced versus how much we fed them, right? How much they ate, how much of the patty they ate. So this is basically centimeters squared of capped brood per grams of pollen product or protein product consumed. And in 2018, it looks like global 15% has great feed efficiency, and then it drops off in 2019 and 2020, but the product hasn't changed substantively, right? Bees haven't changed substantively. So what's going on here? And the difference is 2018 was a really late spring, and so basically almost as soon as we brought the bees out, there was an abundance of pollen in the landscape. 2019 was a much slower year. So we brought the bees out because it was warm, it was an earlier spring. So we brought the bees out because it was warm, but there wasn't that pollen flow available in the landscape. So they were more reliant on the feed that we were feeding them than they were this year when there was lots of natural pollen abundance. So it looks like Global 15 has really high feed efficiency, but that's because it's being subsidized with pollen from the landscape. And 2020, of course, we had a bad yard again, so they were really reliant on the pollen that we were feeding them, or sorry, the product we were feeding them. When we go back to the literature and sort of look across many experiments, and some from Canada, some from the US, the trend that we tend to see is that when experiments are done in a circumstance when there is not naturally pollen available on the landscape, maybe it's a dearth or it's really early in the season, the effect, and I know it doesn't matter if you can't read these graphs, the effect of feed type on brood area and population matters. So when there's nothing else for them to eat, the type of product you're feeding them seems to have a significant effect on their population growth. When there is natural pollen available, there seems to be no effect of patty type on brood area or population, right? So supplementing them still benefits, but it doesn't matter as much what you're feeding them when there's natural pollen available on the landscape. So patties are beneficial in the spring. I think most of the studies that are done in Canada, actually all the studies I've seen that have been done in Canada in the spring have shown a benefit of supplementing them in terms of colony growth. And probably, I would argue, I didn't test it, but I would argue in terms of productivity of your colonies because your population is going to be larger, so they're going to produce more honey. The group in our experiment, the group that received the patties, the groups that received the patties had 6 times more capped brood than the controls that didn't receive the patties within 2 weeks. And so this resulted in adult brood populations available for pollination and for honey production later in the season. But I want you to consider whether, they do, whether the cost and risk of vectoring diseases, the pesticide exposure, differ among all of these products. They do vary, but it's really hard as consumers or purchasers of these products to know what risk you're giving to your bees with these various products because you don't necessarily know the ingredients, let alone what pesticides were sprayed on that soy that was used to make your feed. I want to highlight that, and Rob mentioned this with the pea flower, differences in consumption and cost don't necessarily translate to differences in benefit. Just because they really like the pea flower doesn't mean it's good for them. When there is some pollen available, I think that most of these good pollen supplements and substitutes might be equally productive, and you need to consider more the health and safety of your bees and the cost of these products and the cost of your labor to deliver them. And I would also encourage you to consider the benefits and costs and really target either specific apiaries, specific time points, and specific years. So pay attention to the pollen flow in your area. And once you've started supplementing pollen in the spring, you can't stop until there's a strong pollen flow because that's a surefire way to get your bees to go backwards because they've built up all of this brood and they need to keep feeding it, otherwise they'll starve. Because what do bees do when they run out of pollen and they have brood? They cannibalize the young ones and they cap the older ones early. So you end up with probably arguably weaker, smaller adult bees, and then they cannibalize the young ones to finish rearing the older ones. So when you go out and do your inspections, I'm sure you all know this, but maybe you need to remind some of your employees, your brood should look like this, right? They should be floating on food. You should be able to see white. Even if you need to wear your glasses like this, you should be able to see the white, right? They should look like this larva here, swimming in jelly. If your brood looks like this, you've got a problem. Or at least you did have a problem. You may be able to fix it or help by putting on some supplements, but there's been a dearth in your landscape or some inclement weather, some rain. This is bad news. Sometimes you'll go back and you'll see brood that's swimming in jelly, it's white, but you'll notice there was a gap, right? There's an age class in the brood that's missing, and very often that's because something like this happened and you just missed observing it. So you want to try and avoid this. So one of the things we've done to try and understand what our landscape offers at my apiary at the University of Lethbridge is we've collected pollen over the whole year, right? The whole pollen production cycle. So this is the percent of the pollen, and this is just really roughly categorizing the pollen as either from trees and shrubs, which is this green line, or some kind of herbaceous plant. So any kind of thing like canola is a major flow, sweet clover, any of those non-woody type plants that offer pollen. What we see is that the non-woody plants in the early season, they're not blooming yet, right? They need time to grow. The trees and shrubs, that's 100% of our pollen production early in the season. So when you're selecting apiaries, really look for those trees and shrubs in your landscape that are going to be able to offer you pollen sources. And the trees and shrubs stayed the majority of the pollen until a switch point, sort of early June. And after that point, they really dramatically drop off and the herbaceous plants pick up. So there's this switch point. And you really need both types of vegetation in your landscape to be able to offer year-round resources for your bees. So fall feeding, I promised you we'd get back to that. When you look through the literature, fall supplemental protein feeding there are very few examples of it being beneficial. I'm not saying it can't be under certain circumstances, and I encourage you to talk to Michael about when it can be, in fact, detrimental, and he has theories about that. It can be beneficial if there's a really prolonged period after your pollen flow ends, but before your winter begins. So the bees are out there on the landscape. There's nothing for them to forage. I think of bees as having mileage, right? If you keep them in the garage, it preserves them. If they're out driving around, it wears them out. So if they're out driving around for a long time before winter wears them out, so I think at that point there are sometimes benefits to fall protein feeding, but by and large, I don't think it's beneficial. Spring supplemental protein feeding, I think in our area, it does help the colony populations take advantage of the nectar flows when they arrive, because you have your big populations built up, or your pollination market, depending on what you pollinate and when the timing of that is. Certainly, if you want to do crane rearing, you need to have well-fed colonies. So I think spring feeding is beneficial when you want large populations at a particular targeted time point, so you want to work back from that time point, or where there's areas where there's insufficient spring forage. If you want to learn more about the details, you can feel free to just take a picture of this. It is available free, or if you just go to Google Scholar and just Google my name and protein, it'll come up and it's freely available if you read all the details. And we do go into the nutritional content of all the patties that we tested, so that's also available there. So I want to leave you with a couple thoughts. One is that consumption does not equal benefit. Just because your bees are eating, I can eat a whole family pack of potato chips, the share bowl of Skittles, I can eat it all. It doesn't make me healthier. I'm not having any more kids, right? But it does need to be consumed to have a benefit, right? It's not going to have a benefit if they don't eat it. But just because they eat it doesn't mean it's beneficial. So I want to thank the Alberta Beekeepers Commission, Pullman Apiaries, who worked with me for 3 years on this project and were very tolerant of our experimental intrusions into their apiary. Alltech and Global Patties, they were very helpful in just making whatever kind of patty we want. Clarice and Lene and Jeff were the team who helped me work on this, and the Manitoba Beekeepers Association for inviting me. And finally, I just want to congratulate Rob again. I know you've had a lot of congratulations, but I was not a direct mentee of Rob, but I've certainly benefited from his mentorship of people I collaborate with, and my postdoc supervisor, Steve Purnell, and have really enjoyed collaborating with you over the last more years than I care to admit at this point. So thanks, Rob, and all the best. And I understand we're canceling the last thing, so we have a little time for questions. Rob?
What about winter feeding of protein?
So Rob's question is, what about winter feeding of protein? And I don't know, have you tried it? Because I never have.
Well, I think that the dogma is it's bad, you know.
So Rob's saying the dogma of winter feeding is that it's bad, and I mean, I guess that sort of corresponds with what we've read about and studied about fall feeding, is that it's not beneficial and can in fact be detrimental.
But the dogma itself are also often wrong.
Yeah. I haven't tried it, so I can't say for sure.
You had just briefly mentioned about feeding late into the fall as being a detriment. Would you be able to comment on that?
Yeah, so Steve and Michael Pearson and I did an experiment where we did extended supplemental protein feeding in the spring and the fall, and we did actually see a detrimental effect of the fall feeding at the Beaver Lodge site. We did mirrored experiments in northern and southern Alberta. We saw a detriment of the fall feeding. I think Michael's been exploring the data, so he can answer it better, but his theory is, and kind of makes sense to me, is that the prolonged fall protein feeding actually encourages nosema, and then nosema has a detrimental effect. So I think that's something we need to study a bit further.
How late is, with that, looking into fall feeding as compared to early, let's say in August, how late into the fall would you say that detriment would start?
We did it in September, I believe. Is that right?
Yeah, well, we were feeding continuously from the end of the
flow, yeah.
bloom until wrapping the hives, there was a negative effect. The protein supplemented hives over a couple of years at all three of the locations had a somewhat negative effect. It was strongly negative at Beaver Lodge. It was sort of trivially negative in Lethbridge.
But there also haven't been very many studies that have shown a benefit of feeding late in the season either.
So late would be like middle of September?
We would have kept feeding until we wrapped the hives. So it was a pollen patty every 2 weeks, more or less. The amount that was fed differed a little bit. The timing of feeding differed a little bit among the locations, but it was essentially to make sure that the bees had continuous access to a protein patty from the end of Canoma bloom through the, we would have wrapped up around Halloween.
When did you wrap it?
We
Wrapped around Halloween.
Was it pollen patties or open supplement? Because I recall Randy Oliver saying something that some commercial beekeepers anecdotally said feeding open pollen supplement, and if it gets stored over winter turns toxic. So there's no evidence, but just there.
So the question was whether this pollen feeding in the fall was open feeding or in-hive supplementation, and it was in-hive.
Over here, Shelley. Great talk, really thorough investigation. Thinking back to the earlier part of your talk where you observed differences in consumption and then told us that the sucrose versus glucose fructose levels were different. That doesn't quite explain the fact that you saw roughly equal amounts of brood, because they shouldn't make brood from sucrose or fructose, right? So I'm wondering, is there other macro or micro things that are different that might explain it, like a limiting amino acid or something like that?
So the patties are all different, right? They do have different amino acids, different limiting amino acids, but I think the biggest difference, the reason I think I didn't see a difference in brood production in that year was because of the natural pollen that was available as well. So even though they were eating more or less of it, it didn't matter because they were eating so much of I couldn't measure how much pollen they were bringing in and consuming.
Well, I have a question, Shelley. Sorry? You talked about the quality of the yard site and the season. One thing you didn't talk about was bee bread. When you did these studies, were you starting the experiment with nukes or packaged bees on completely clean comb that didn't have any bee bread in it? And is that part of the explanation?
No, so these were all singles that had been made up the year before. We just sort of, I mean, they were randomly assigned to the treatment. So they would have had a random assignment of comb that had been used for multiple years previously. And whatever they had stored the previous year was randomized among all of the treatment groups.
Okay, so there would have been some.
There was some, anecdotally, there was not very much, but there would have been some, yeah.
Because I've quite frequently seen a larger, quite a large amount of bee red in spring. I've been shocked to see how much there was, and so maybe that's why I often haven't seen as much benefit.
Yeah, perhaps. I mean, you have to remember where the study was done, right? It's done in Lethbridge. We don't really have a lot of late season pollen plants. It's kind of once canola's done, there's not a lot for them to eat.
That's it.
Thank you.